various aspects of endometrial hyperplasia. Now, endometrial hyperplasia is a heterogeneous group of proliferative disorders of the endometrium, and in this, the endometrium undergoes certain hyperplastic changes, as the name suggests, and which may be lead to malignancy later on, which is as it becomes atypical. The earliest classification of this was in 1975, when it was classified as cystic glandular hyperplasia, adenomatous hyperplasia, and atypical hyperplasia. And this classification was further modified in 1994 when we divided into, into simple hyperplasia, complex hyperplasia, and atypical hyperplasia was further divided into simple atypical hyperplasia and complex atypical hyperplasia. And depending upon the amount of mitotic figures and some other changes, these changes were, and the complex atypical hyperplasia had a more poorer prognosis. Simple hyperplasia is simply the increase in the number of endometrial glands, and there is a glandular crowding. The glands, the interglandular stroma becomes less, and the glands may become tubular, dilated, or slightly irregular. There is absence of cytological atypia in simple hyperplasia, and it is generally not a very malignant condition. Now, if we see, this is the simple hyperplasia, and there is increase in the number of glands, and there is still some glandular stroma, but still it is slightly more than what could be seen in the progesteronic phase. And in between the glands you can see some stroma, but still there is crowding. If we see on high power, we will not see many mitotic figures. There is focal glandular crowding. This is a slide of proliferative phase in which the stroma is much more, and there is some areas there is some crowding. Now, this is slide of when after menstruation there is focal glandular crowding, and sometimes we get a menstrual sample also. Now the glands, they are tubular, and there is again, if you see, we don't see any mitotic figures. This comes in various multiple possibilities. Here the glands may be dilated or slightly irregular. Now this is a disordered proliferative phase, and in which we see the glands there is some spiralization and they are irregular, and these are irregular glands. Sometimes in practical sense, there is a very thin line in the proliferative phase and the hyperplasia. I mean, sometimes some colleagues, they say it is just progesteronic phase, and some say it is the hyperplasia. I mean, basically we have to link it with the clinical features and whether there is uterine excessive bleeding, irregular bleeding. All those features have to be correlated. If you see the cytological atypia is absent. Another slide in which we do not see any cytological atypia, and the glands, there are no vacuoles. Here in this slide there are some vacuoles, but the cytological atypia is now the mimics of hyperplasia. As I said, quite often there is a proliferative endometrium and it looks like hyperplasia, and again this has to be correlated with the clinical picture and the last menstrual period. I mean, it's a dicey sometimes. Now, the complex hyperplasia is when the glands occur with back-to-back crowding, and there are glands with irregular outlines and marked structural complexity. This means that the stroma in between the glands, it is less, and there is glands, they start touching each other, and also in this slide also glands, they are back-to-back crowding. Here again there is back-to-back crowding, and gradually we start finding some findings of atypia, and the glands, they are very irregular. Start finding mitotic figures, and in the atypical variant we get nuclear rounding and enlargement. The nuclei, they come together, so they are stratified, come close to each other. They lose their polarity, that is, they are not parallel to each other. And we also find features of malignancy, that is nuclear pleomorphism and prominent nucleoli, depending upon which stage we are working. We also find that there is atypical hyperplasia. You can see here there is the nuclei there, instead of being elongated, they start becoming round and parallel to each other. There is nuclear enlargement, and we also find the prominent nucleoli. Loss of polarity, that is, the nuclei are no longer parallel to each other, and the chromatin is irregularly dispersed. And we also find nuclear pleomorphism in the gland. As we move forward in the hierarchy, the atypical variant gradually becomes malignant, and we also find the well-differentiated carcinomas. There is a desmoplastic variant, that is, the spindle-shaped cells can be seen, the fibroblasts are seen, the stroma becomes elongated, the nuclei in the stroma, they become elongated, and also we find lot of mitotic figures. In the well-differentiated carcinoma, we find the confluence, the cribriform pattern, and this is also a feature of a single gland with sieve-like arrangement of glands within the, which is known as cribriform pattern, and this becomes visible in well-differentiated carcinoma. There is a glandular confluence. Here also another slide. This is on high power. You can see the another one, cribriform pattern. Now this is papillary pattern which is seen in the well-differentiated carcinoma. Papillae-like growths are sometimes seen at the other end of the hierarchy. Another one with papillary patterns. This is the papillary pattern, papilla-like growth. Mitotic figures are there, and papillary pleomorphism is there. Now, one feature which really troubles is sometimes we get whether what we are getting is true papillae or pseudo papillae. That is just whether there is a stalk in between or not, and they could be just surface epithelium with the papillary enfoldings and not a true growth. So we have to be careful about these. And sometimes we also get papillary syncytial metaplasia, and which mimics a carcinoma. Another slide of well-differentiated carcinoma, when there is nuclear pleomorphism and the nucleoli, they become prominent. Tumor necrosis is an important marker. I mean, sometimes we don't get adequate slides and adequate specimen, and if we find a lot of necrosis in the slide, we can think in terms of well-differentiated carcinoma. It's a very common problem that the inadequate biopsy comes, or just there is some dysfunctional uterine bleeding and there is a amount of specimen received is inadequate. So the presence of necrosis helps us think in terms of well-differentiated carcinomas. Quite often we find squamous metaplasia, and this is the hyperplasia, and with the areas of keratin or just squamous cells can be seen, and this on high part the squamous cells can be seen, and we can do some special stainings for these. Another slide with squamous metaplasia. There is hyperplasia and carcinoma, and we also find stromal histiocytes sometimes, which can be seen in some parts of the slide. Another slide with lot of histiocytes in the middle. Another slide with histiocytes with foamy cytoplasm can be seen. Another slides with the hyperplasia or carcinomas. Here again we are at a fix whether to label it as hyperplasia or carcinoma. The mimicking is quite, they look the same, and we have to be very careful on high power for labeling it as a carcinoma. Sometimes just a hyperplasia with some mitotic figures can be seen, and quite often a borderline. We have to be very careful. Experience is needed, and some criteria need to be applied, and quite often we have to write this diagnosis. Atypical endometrial hyperplasia cannot exclude carcinoma. This is just to save our skin from consumer protection and give a so that the decision whether to put it on the clinician, and patient has to be observed over a period of time, or repeat sample has to be taken, and whether the lady has completed her family or not completed her family, all those points come into